Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Yud Gimel. We're going to start right at the top. Before we start, I want to do a little bit of background based on some questions I saw about this concept of Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. We need to build a sukkah and not take something that was already built. So as I mentioned before, when we talk about building a sukkah, we're always talking about the schach, not the walls. That's very important to know. The schach is the part that goes on the top of the sukkah. The first thing that's important to know is that in order to make sure that it's not something that was already in existence, it has to be, okay, this is something we didn't really discuss, but it's very important to understand, your walls have to be there first and then your schach. Otherwise, if I build, let's say I even build it from scratch for the purpose of Sukkot, and I put my schach on first and then my walls, the sukkah is disqualified because it's nothing without walls. It's true the walls are a secondary part, but you have to have the walls. Therefore, and since the building of the sukkah is the building of the schach particularly, you put schach on and then walls. It's very similar to that case where I put the bundles and then, built my schach underneath, where first the roof was there. The roof was there without walls, without anything. It wasn't a sukkah. And then when I built the walls, the sukkah, the schach was already there. So therefore, you always have to build the walls first, and only after that can you put your schach on. It's a very, very important halacha to understand. The second thing someone asked about was a mat. If you take a mat, a pre-made mat, which we have mats of schach, I use that in my house, and then you unroll it on top of the sukkah, why is that not a problem? So it's not a problem at all because you're putting it there for it's true, the mat is pre-made. You don't need to have the schach itself be something you make yourself. The mat is pre-made, that's fine. You have to put it there for the purposes of schach. So again, assuming you put it there after your walls are already up, that serves as your schach. Okay, so that's all the idea of Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. It means, again, how does this work with Beit Hillel, who says you can even take a Sukkah Yeshana? Remember, we said that lahalacha, and it appears in the commentaries, in Yerushalmi it says, and other commentaries, that you have to still move it. Okay? It's not enough. You could take a sukkah that was already in existence before, but you have to move the schach a little bit to show that you're putting something down for the purposes of sukkah, just like a pergola. Right? Some people, you can take out, if you have slats in your pergola that can come out and back in, you can do that. Some people are careful anyway to put some schach on top, just to have it more symbolically for the holiday of Sukkot. But it seems like technically, halachically, simple halacha, all you have to do is pick up the slats and put them back down. That's enough to say, I'm doing this for the purposes of a holiday. Okay, so again, Beit Hillel doesn't really need it to be for the holiday, but what he does need, and this is what we saw in Gzerat Otzar in yesterday's stuff, that it has to be for the purposes of shade and not like taking your storage house, which might have schach on it. Let's say it doesn't have a roof, but it has a roof made of schach. That would not work because it wasn't put there for the purposes of shade. The schach has to be put up for the purposes of shade, even according to Beit Hillel. It's just a matter of not necessarily for the holiday of Sukkot. Then for the holiday of Sukkot, we add to Beit Hillel, even Beit Hillel agrees that you have to move it a little bit. With that, let's move on and let's see about different types of schach. So we ended, the last thing we saw was about the shoshe and shveitzre, which was black licorice and wormwood. And we saw that according to the first opinion of Rav Yehuda, you can use it for schach because it's not food. Came Abai and he said, we can't use the wormwood because it has a bad smell and it will cause people to leave the sukkah. Similarly, we're going to have another halacha by Rav Chanan bar Rava. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava hani hizmi v'higi. We're talking about shrubs, thorns and thistles, like shrubs that have pokey thorns on pokey bristles on them. Misachachim behu. Again, these are not food. If they're not food, they're not susceptible to impurity, in which case we can use them for schach. Abai amal, but it comes in Abai, it says, no. Behizmi misachachin and behigi lo misachachin. You can use thorns, but you can't use the thistles. Why not? My taima. What might happen? Stuff might fall down from them. They're kind of like cut shrubs that you use. And some of these thorny pieces are going to fall into your food, right? Imagine you're sitting eating soup in the sukkah. And every few seconds, the wind blows and these thorns come down into your food. It's going to be disgusting. You're not going to eat them. And therefore, you're not going to want to sit in the sukkah. You're going to leave your sukkah and say, I'm going inside to eat. This is not a pleasant way to eat. And therefore, again, this goes with Abaye, who talked before about all these different rabbis said that you need a dirak keva. It needs to be like the way you live in your house. This is not a pleasant way to live in your house, to have things coming into your food all the time, right? Imagine your ceiling is falling apart and drops into your food. You would never eat in a room like that. So likewise here, you can't have a sukkah like that. Amar of Gidel Amar, hi afkuta de dikla. Again, another situation. This is a little bit different. We learned in the Mishnah that you can't take bundles of straw and wood, etc. But this is something that even though, okay, these are branches, okay, different debate about what exactly it is, but it seems some type of branches, maybe from the root. Some people say it's at the top of the palm tree. Actually, the top sounds more reasonable, right? Where at the top we have this lulav type thing, which is sort of like different branches bound together, okay? Or maybe it's something that grows from the bottom that also has a similar thing where it's one branch, but there's things coming out of it that are sort of bound together. But we're going to see the difference between them being bound together and the ones in the Mishnah. We'll see in a minute what the difference is. Even though they're bound, this is bound by the hands of God, meaning that's how it grows. It's not like a person took it and bound it. The person taking it and bound it is a bundle. And that's a problem because, again, you might come back from carrying your bundle and then you'll put it on top of your sukkah and then you'll change your mind, right? You'll put it to dry out. You'll think that you're doing it for the purposes of, right? You'll change your mind, decide, oh, you know what? I want to use it as my sukkah, and you won't move it. And you'll end up with a sukkah that wasn't something that you put the schach there for the purposes of schach. But here, this is not bound for that reason. This is bound by nature. So therefore, it's not an issue. Even if later you come and actually bind it, let's say they start, right, like imagine a lulav, it starts coming apart, and you actually would bind these leaves together, still, this is binding one thing together. When you bind one thing together, it's not, that's not considered bound. Bound has to be a number of items. Remember, we saw the Yerushalmi, it's 25 items. We're going to see in the Gemara, it seems to say 3. And 2 is questionable, but certainly 1 would not be a problem. These pokey reeds, okay? These are, right, they're branches. They say the reeds have things that come out from underneath, like the bottom part by the roots. So the dukre dekane mesachachim behu, you can use this schach. These are also bound together. But again, they're bound together by nature, God, and therefore that's not considered bound. And just like the other one, even if you now come and bind them because they're getting loose, that's still not called eged. It's only one item, right? It's one item that has things coming off of it. Still considered one item. It's not an issue. Tanya namihachi. Here's a braita to support. Kanim v'dokanim mesachachim behem. So reeds and these pokey, these branches that come out from the reeds, you can use for schach. So the Gemara says, kanim pshita. You wouldn't need to tell us reeds. Obviously, you can use reeds. They're thin. They're not too thick, which we're going to get to in tomorrow's daf, and they're not susceptible to impurity because you don't eat them. So obviously, so therefore they say, ema kanim shel dokanim mesachachim behem. It must be the dokranim of the kanim, right? Or the kanim that have these dokranim, these parts coming out. That must be what it means when it says kanim, and therefore there's your proof for what we just said. We're now on a totally different topic. We'll get back to the maror later and connect it. We're going to talk about maror for Pesach. Okay, you wonder how on earth did we get there? We're going to get back there. There's a bit of a strange order in the Gemara because we start with the maror, then when it relates only to Pesach, then we're going to get off on other things and then come back to the maror as it relates to schach. So he says, Rav Chisda in the name of Ravina Bar Shila, the marirata da'agma, this maror, okay, maror is basically a bitter vegetable. This bitter vegetable, the da'agma, which grows by the lake, and it's called the maror of the lake. Adam yotzei behen yedecha b'tov Pesach. You can use this for Pesach. It's considered a bitter herb. Meitive, the Gemara questions this and says, wait a minute. Ezov, when it talks about hyssop, and there, hyssop is used in various places in the Torah. One of them is for someone who has leprosy. They use this agudat ezov. They use the ezov, this hyssop, wrapped with other things. And then they dip into the blood of the bird. There's a whole procedure they do. Ezov, velo ezov yavan. You can't use the Greek ezov, the Greek hyssop. Velo ezov kuchli, and not the blue hyssop. Velo ezov midbari, and not the desert one. Velo ezov romi, and not the Roman hyssop. V'lo ezov sheyesh l'shem levad. No hyssop that has a term, a modifier with it. Has to be pure ezov, pure hyssop, and not hyssop with another name. So therefore, they say, how could you possibly say when the Torah says maror, sounds like a bitter herb without a name, not maror de agma, not the maror of the lake. It would have to be plain maror. So we're going to have two different explanations. Amar Abai, kol shenishtane shmo kodem matan Torah. If it had its name already, this with the shem levad, like the Greek hyssop and the desert hyssop, then before the Torah was given, ubat Torah v'ikpid aleh, and then the Torah said, no, we want ezov specifically. So when the Torah said it, it came to exclude anything that existed before its time. Therefore, right, ikpida biyadua sheyesh lo shem levad, because it was said, I know it has some other names, but I don't want that one. This is the one you have to take. V'hane, but this maror de agma lo nishtana shmayu kodem matan Torah klal. But this one didn't have its name before Matan Torah. How they know that is a good question. Abaye claims this wasn't called the maror of the lake before Matan Torah, and therefore the Torah wasn't excluding this when it said al matzot u'mirorim yochlu, eat it with matzah and maror, right? Possibly also because it says mirorim, which seems to include different types of maror. That's another possibility, although it's not really what Abaye says. That's the first answer. Rava Amar Hani Milirata Stamashmayu. This maror of the lake is really maror. It's just called Haide Karile Miriuta de Agma. The reason they call it maror of the lake is Mishum de Mishtakach Agma. They're trying to tell you where would you find this type of maror? You find it near the lake. So they call it maror of the lake, but it's not a different type or something, right? Let's say the Greek hyssop is a different type of hyssop. This is just a name to tell you where would you find this maror? You find it near the lake. But it's not really a descriptive, a modifier of the type of maror that it is. Amar Rav Chisda. Okay, back to our issue of eged. Okay, again, as I said, this is a little bit out, a non sequitur, but we're going to see how it connects in a little while. Rav Chisda says, "Igei bicha lo shmei eged." Right, this really should have been before when we were talking about one binding one thing is not called eged, even if let's say the thing goes out into different directions, still not called eged. So Rav Chisda says, "Igei bicha lo shmei eged." One is not. Shalosh shmei eged. Again, against the Yerushalmi, you said 25 would be a bundle. Here it says 3 is already considered a bundle. Shnayim machloket, but 2 is already a debate. Who is a debate between? Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanit. How do we know? We're going to read a source. The way it's going to be a little bit complicated. They're going to read a Mishnah. It's going to sound like Rabbi Yossi holds one and Tanna Kama holds the other. And then we're going to actually flip it and say, no, you've got it all wrong. Ditna, mitzvah, and it's really that Tanna Kama holds what you thought Rabbi Yossi holds, and Rabbi Yossi holds what you thought Tanna Kama holds. It's going to be a little confusing. That's why I'm explaining in advance what's going to happen. Ditna, mitzvat ezov shlosha klachim, ubahem shlosha givolim. The mitzvah of ezov is to take 3 stalks, and from each stalk, bahem shlosha givolim. You take 3 stalks of this hyssop, and each one has its own stem. Okay, so there's first the stalk, which Rashi says is the roots, connected with the roots maybe, or partly the roots. And from that, there's a stem that comes out of it. So that's the mitzvah of ezov, to take 3, because you have to do a binding of the ezov, a bundle of them. A bundle is 3. Rabbi Yossi Omer, so now that sounds like Tanna Kama holds 3, right? And then Shnayim machloket, meaning 2 would not work. Rabbi Yossi Omer, mitzvat ezov shlosha givolim. You need these 3 stems, but shiarav shnayim. But if one fell, or you're only left with 2 for whatever reason, something happens to one of them, it's still good. So that sounds like he thinks 2 is okay. V'gardumav kol shehu. Let's say you have your bundle of 3, but one of them disintegrates and is so little, as long as it's a teeny little bit, that's still considered 1. Okay, whether it's 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3, doesn't really matter, but it's still considered 1, even if you have a little bit left of only one of them, or maybe all of them. Kasal kadatim, right? We're not going to really focus on this garduma, this little bit that's left. So when they read this, they thought, midisharav shnayim, from the fact that it says if you're left with only 2, it's still okay. That you can even start with 2, even though he didn't say that. And that's what's going to cause some of the confusion here. He said, if you're only left with 2, if you started with 3, but you're left with 2, it's okay. They assume that means that he thinks even starting with 2 would be okay. Now, so why did it say 3? Mitzvah. That's because ideally you should start with 3. But if you're only left with 2, it's fine, which even means if you started with 2, it would also be fine. And therefore they assume, Mida Rabbi Yossi, Shlosha the mitzvah, since Rabbi Yossi thinks Shlosha is only 3 is only for a mitzvah, meaning ideally, but if you really start with 2, it's fine. It must be l'Rabbanan, Shlosha la'akev. It must be according to the rabbis. When they said 3 stalks with 3 stems, they meant 3 has to be 3. It can't be less than 3. So now they say, if that's the case, okay, and then that matches, right, our opinions then line up. 2 would be Rabbi Yossi says it's okay, and the rabbis would say no way. Can't possibly say that because Vahatanya, even though that's what it looks like from this Mishnah, we're going to bring another source from the same time period that describes a different machloket between, and it describes our opinions more in detail, which is going to explain that Rabbi Yossi actually doesn't agree with what we thought he said. If you start out with 2 and you're left with only 1, it's disqualified. That means you can't start with 2. And here we're going to see. You might have thought, well, you could start with 2 if you end with 2, because he says if you start with 2 and end with 1, it's no good. Maybe if you start with 2 and end with 2, it is. But look at the next line. Ve'eino kasher, it's not going to be good. Has to be that you start with 3 and end with 2. So there you have it. Doesn't work. So now he clearly says if you start with 3 and end with 2, it's no good. So Rabbi Yossi has to be the one who says 2 is no good. So now they're going to say, so ipuch, Rabbi Yossi, so flip what we said. Rabbi Yossi shlosha la'akev. He's the one who says you have to start with 3. It's true that you can end with 2, but you have to start with 3. And Rabbanan shlosha la'mitzvah. This is a good example of where there's the ideal, what you have to start with. It could be, even though that's the ideal, and it has to happen in that way, according to Rabbi Yossi. It doesn't work for you to start with 2. But if you started properly and then over time one of them got lost, that still would be okay because you started off right. Okay, that's an interesting theory in and of itself about the Shirayim and what's left. It's not really what we're focusing on, but it's something to think about. So now, and then Rabbanan shlosha mitzvah, the rabbis, all the rabbis said was you need 3 stalks with 3 stems. They didn't say, what if you don't have that? So we can assume that's the ideal, but if you started with 2, it would also work. Now, we're going to further prove this by bringing another braita. So we're going to now, we've switched the opinions. Who says what? We thought Rabbi Yossi was the one who was more lenient. Turns out he's the one who's stricter. And here we're going to see it from a braita. Now this braita doesn't say who it is, but it's going to be clear that this braita contradicts what Rabbi Yossi said. And therefore it's going to be obvious that Rabbi Yossi is not the author of this braita, in which case it must be the rabbi's opinion. And that's going to prove that the rabbis think you can start with 2. So Ezov, tchilato shnayim v'shiarav echad kasher. If you start with 2 and you end with 1, it's okay. This is where it's clear it's not Rabbi Yossi, because what did Rabbi Yossi say? Right? Go back a few lines. Tchilato shnayim v'shiarav echad, same case. Pasul, it's disqualified. So therefore, this must be not Rabbi Yossi. So now, if you start with 2 and you end with 1, it's still good. So there you see it. You can start with 2. Ve'ino pasul, it's only going to be disqualified. Ad sheyeh tchilato v'shiarav echad. It has to be that you start with 1 and end with 1, that's when it's going to be disqualified. To which the Gemara questions for a minute. So actually, right? So now the Gemara question says, "Shirav echad pasul." Wait, it says if you're left with 1, it's disqualified in this last part of that braita. But the beginning part of that braita said, "Ha'amar shirav echad kasher." Now it's true they were different, because one started with 2 and went to 1, and the other started with 1 and went to 1. But basically, shirav echad, we already know, is no good. I'm sorry. In the first case, if you're left with 1, it's okay. In the second case, if you're left with 1, it's not okay. So that seems to contradict. So the Gemara says, Ela ema, and you could have understood this even before they asked, but I guess they're just trying to clarify. Ela ema agite tchilato kishiarav echad. What it's really focusing is not on the remainder, but on the beginning. Start with 2 and end with 1, that's fine. But if you start and end with 1, in other words, if the beginning is like the remainder, meaning you only started with 1, then you're going to be in trouble. That is not going to work. You definitely can't start with 1 because that's not considered something that's bound. So there we have it. Again, that clearly is Rabbi Yossi. I'm sorry, that clearly is not Rabbi Yossi because it contradicts what we just said. Rabbi Yossi said, starting with 2 and ending with 1 is no good. And here it says starting with 2, ending with 1 is good. Must be Tanakama. There you see Tanakama says 2 is okay, meaning 2 is considered bound. And Rabbi Yossi thinks 2 is not considered bound. only when it's the remainder, but that's something different. That's because you started off with it bound properly. Darish Meremer, another case. Hane Isuriyata de Surah. These are reeds that they bundled up in the city of Surah. Why did they do this? They did it, okay, not for the purposes of carrying, that we were talking about the bundles before were to carry, and you might carry them home and put them on your sukkah to dry out. These, afagav da'agdan, even though they're bound, leminyana be'al da'agdan, they're bound in order to have a number system. We bind, let's say, 10 in a bundle. And then every bundle has 10. So if you go to buy, you know exactly how many are in here. Like in Israel, for example, they always have bags of pitot of 10, right? Or 5. I've never seen them in multiples other than 5 or 10. Everybody knows in a bag, there's either 5 or there's 10. By 5 and 10, you can easily distinguish. Or pencils. You get a pencil box, right? And before lead pens, right? The ones with the lead inside, but the main old yellow pencils we used to take to school, right? We still use them sometimes in my house. Those always come in a box of 12. They're in a box of 12. Once they're boxed, they're 12, right? If you buy them individually, obviously they're not. But if you buy them in a box, you know exactly how many you're getting. If that's the case, these are bound not for the purposes of carrying. They're bound for the purposes of knowing how many are in there. That means when you get home, when you come back, you immediately open them up. You never leave them bundled. The purpose isn't for them to be bundled in the pencils. Maybe you would leave them in the box till you use them so they don't get lost, because pencils often just get lost. But this would be something that you wouldn't really leave bundled, and therefore it's not an issue for schach. You don't have to worry about the gzerat otzar, because it's unlikely you're going to dry them out on top of your sukkah and then end up creating your sukkah from that. Amal habi abba, hanit slife de orbane. This is some sort of hut that they would use, or area that they would use to cover something that was made up of aravot, which are what we use for the willow branches. They would bind them at the top, and then they'd spread out at the bottom. I believe there's a picture of this. I didn't check the pictures today, but I think there's a picture. And then I know in the Schottenstein, there's a picture for sure. Probably in the Koren also this picture. And then they would intertwine the bottom of them, because imagine willow branches, you bind them at the top, they're all over at the bottom. So you would kind of braid a string through the bottom of them in order to keep them together at the bottom, but much wider at the bottom. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. So now he says, if you untie the top part, which is really where they're bound properly, then you can use them for a sukkah, for schach. So now they say, but they're still bound at the bottom. So we're going to have two answers. Amar Papa Desharilu. He says, you cut them at the bottom. Now you didn't undo the braid. They're braided in. It's kind of like woven in by hand. You didn't undo that part. So they are still somewhat together, but you did cut the string, which means ultimately, right? Imagine if I braided my hair, but I didn't put a ponytail holder in. So eventually it would all come out. It wouldn't stay bound together. It might stay for a few minutes, but it'll ultimately come apart. That's why this is really not considered bound, because it's very loosely bound. Huna Beredu Rav Yoshua says, "Afilu tema de lo shari lehu." Even if you don't untie them, kol eged she'ein asur letaltelo lo shmei eged. The one at the top was bound so that you could carry it all in one go. The bottom part, which is much wider, was bound just to keep them together. It wasn't bound for the purposes of carrying it. And again, the whole concern is I'll carry my bundle home because it's in a bundle to make it easier for carrying, and then I'll put it on top of my sukkah to dry out. That's not a concern here, because these aren't bound for the purposes of carrying, so there's clearly no issue. Now we're back to the vegetables, the maror. Okay, again, we're still not up to schach. We'll get there in a minute. These maror, the people can use for maror. Now, what's the issue? Maror is a food. On the other hand, it's also a vegetable, and it's not something that people, right, generally, it's right. There's a few issues with it. Number one, it is susceptible to impurity because it's food. On the other hand, it's not exactly a food because it's this bitter herb. And now they're going to say, one second, I want to check one thing. Right. Rashi says that it's not really food, and that's why we're not going to consider this susceptible to impurity. That would be schach pasul for that reason. Okay, even though we do eat it on Pesach, so it's a little bit tricky here. But let's assume this isn't susceptible to impurity. So the first thing is, it's mivi'im tatuma. What does that mean? If I have a covering, and underneath that covering, there's a dead body or part of a dead body, right? Let's say part of the flesh, a kezayit's worth. then whatever, even though, let's say, here's the item, on top you have this covering, everything under that covering, let's say you have some sort of a roof or something, right? A board, whatever's under that board, let's say I have a utensil there, is going to be impure. It's like ohel, it's like a tent. However, so let's take the maror. I have a big piece of lettuce going across. Underneath part of it is a part of a dead body. Anything under that maror on the other side of that maror, that lettuce, is going to be impure, right? Carry impurity from a dead body. So if there's a utensil there, it will become impure. However, normally that would be what we call ohel. Now, ohel usually has the property that, number one, everything underneath it will be impure, even though, right, it's not touching or not right next to it. It could be underneath on the side. Number two, it means that it blocks any tumah from going up. We talked about this just the other day. Normally, tumah goes all the way up if there's no covering on it, like a grave. But if you have a roof, then it blocks the tumah from going up. So it might go out to the sides, but it doesn't go up. That's called chotzetz b'fnei tumah. So according to our version of the Gemara, I'll already tell you there's different versions, but our version of the Gemara says, mivi'im et hatumah, it creates impurity underneath that lettuce. However, ein chotzetzim b'fnei tumah. It's got kind of two aspects to it. It's treated like a tent to a certain extent, but not to the other. Really, we're going to be stringent in all directions. We're going to make it impure what's underneath it, but we're not going to allow it to purify things that are above it, to say, oh, they're exempt. No, if you go straight up from that, not to the side, but if you go straight up from where the dead body is, everything above that piece of lettuce is going to be impure also. Let's say you have a utensil sitting right on top of the lettuce, which is above the dead body, right in the place where it's above. Won't work to the side, but in the place where it's above, it doesn't block tumah. Now, why is that? We're going to see right now. One more thing before we get there. Uposlim b'sukkah mishum avir. The reason why you can't use this in a sukkah is not because it's disqualified schach. It's because it's as if it's nothing. It's as if you have no schach. Okay, what's the difference? If it's disqualified because it's impure, right? Because let's say it's not susceptible, it is susceptible to impurity, and then it would be disqualified schach. That only messes up your sukkah at a width of 4 handbreadths, 4 tvachim. Whereas if it's avir, okay, so if I have a sukkah and I have 4 tvachim of kosher, then I have 4 tvachim of not kosher, and then 4 tvachim of kosher, 4 tvachim of non-kosher. If it's 4 tvachim of non-kosher, it's going to disqualify my sukkah. If it's less than 4 handbreadths, since it's not what we call makom chashuv, in important enough space, we're going to ignore the disqualified schach and go by the kosher schach. However, when it comes to space in the sukkah, you can't have big gaps. How big a gap? This is laws of levud, less than 3 tvachim. If it's 3 tvachim of space, empty space, it already disqualifies your schach because this is not considered connected, the schach, right? The piece on this side, the piece on that side. If it's less than 3, then we view it as all one continuum. We ignore the space, but at 3 handbreadths, it's already a problem. So if you say it's because of avir, we look at this maror as if it's not even there. We'll talk in a minute about why. Since we view it as if it's not there, therefore, we has laws of schach pasul, which means at a width of 3 tvachim, it's already going to be disqualified, as opposed to, it's already going to ruin your sukkah, I should say, as opposed to disqualified schach, which would have to be 4 tvachim wide to ruin your sukkah. So that's the relevance of that line. Now, what's the reason? My timer, since it's going to dry up soon, what happens to maror? It's just leaves. They're going to dry up, shrivel up, and fall down. Therefore, it's kiman delit nehudami. It's as if it's not there. So when it comes to tumah underneath it, we'll still view it as there at the present time while it's there, and it will create impurity even next to, right, underneath the lettuce on the other side where there isn't even a dead body. But when it comes to blocking off impurity, since it's going to disintegrate soon, we don't allow it to block, and we view it in the sukkah as if it's really not schach at all. That's why we got into this whole maror thing, it seems. Another halach. Habotzer lagad. Okay, we need a little background here. If you learn the last Masechet of Shas, it's called Masechet Uktzin. Okay, when you do a Siyum Shas, it's always right. It's the last one you finish with. So it's a very short 3-chapter Masechet about the handles of. It's all about impurity. It's about the handles of fruits and vegetables. You have, right, like grapes. Okay, this is what we're going to talk about. Grapes have the little stem. right, that attaches the grape to the cluster. That stem is functional, right? When you pick up the grapes, you're holding that stem. So that stem has use. Since it's useful to pick up the fruit, therefore, it's going to have impurity. And not only that, but it's considered connected to the fruit. So if the fruit becomes impure, the stem becomes impure. And likewise, reverse. If the stem becomes impure, the fruit becomes impure. But we're going to see a case where it's not going to be the situation. Amar Rabbi Amma Amar Rav Huna, he says, Habotzer lagat, if you take the grapes and you put it in the wine press, ein lo yadot. Now that's different than eating them. In this case, the yadot, if you end up with stems there of the grapes, they don't have impurity. They don't have laws of impurity, not them, and they don't move impurity from one to the other. Let's say that is attached to the grape. If it becomes impure, it doesn't pass on impurity to the grape itself. Because why? 1 second. I just want to check one thing. Right. So what it really means is I think it itself could become impure, but it wouldn't pass on impurity to the grape that it was attached to. Why not? Because at that point, you don't want the stems. In fact, you really don't want the stems because you want the grapes, you want the juice. And soon we're going to see that it's even detrimental. But besides the fact that you just don't want the stems in there anymore because all you want is the juice, it's not functioning for you because you're not carrying the grapes. Therefore, there's no law of yadot, of handles. Rabbanit bar Gad, Rav Huna, he says in the name of Rav Huna, hakotzer laschach ein lo yadot. If you cut wheat, right, the wheat has the stalk and it has attached to the end of the stalk, there's the grain. And on the grain, there's the chaff, right? There's the piece that there's a piece that is kind of holds the grain in place. So now, if you cut the wheat for schach, ein lo yadot. The part that holds the grain in place is also useless to you because you don't need the grain to be there. So therefore, once you do that, if the part that holds the grain in place becomes impure, that doesn't make the grain itself, right? It doesn't make the kernel impure. Manda Amar Kotzer. Now we're going to look at these two things and try to connect between them. The one who says Kotzer, Kol shekain botzer, de lo nichale, de lo nimtzeh lechambre. If you said that when you cut it for the schach, you don't need the grain, and therefore the yad no longer has a din of yad, you don't need it anymore, you would for sure say the same thing with the grapes, because not only do you not need the stem for the grapes, but all the more so, you don't even want it there, because what will happen if you leave those stems in there? They might absorb some of the grape juice, in which case you're going to lose some of your juice, and you don't want to lose your juice. So of course you would say in that case, but manda amar botzel she'en lo yadot, aval kotzer yesh lo yadot. But if you say it by the botzel, by the grapes, you might not say the same thing by the schach, because denichale de l'schach behu ki echido lelivderan. Having those grains in the schach would help weigh down your schach so the whole thing doesn't start scattering and blowing in the wind. It keeps it weighed down. So you could say that maybe there is a little bit of a purpose to those kernels being there, which means that the yad does serve a purpose, which means that the yad maybe could become tameh. So the one who says by the grapes, Rabbi Abba, in the name of Rav Huna, wouldn't necessarily say the same thing by the kotzer laschach, by the grains. What's interesting about this is just notice that both Rabbi Abba and Rav Menashe said it in the name of Rav Huna, but it's a matter of what Rav Huna said and how far his words would go. So that's the debate that's what the Gemara says about them. It's not clear, right? The one who says kotzer would agree in botzer, but the one who says botzer with the grapes wouldn't necessarily agree with the wheat, or wouldn't agree, not even wouldn't necessarily. They really think he wouldn't agree at all. So now we're gonna go further. Nema de Rav Menashe bar Gada tonight. Let's suggest that what Rav Menashe bar Gada says is actually a machloket tanaim, whether this applies to kotzer or not. Titania. Suche te'inim ubahem te'inim, parkilin ubahen anavim, kashim ubahem shibolim, machbedot ubahem tzmalim. Okay, these are branches of the figs or leaves of the figs, and there's figs attached. Branches of the grapes, and there's grapes attached. Stalks of grain, and there's grain attached. And the stalks of the palm tree, and there's dates attached. Kulan im psolet muval ochlim kasher. It all goes by how much psolet is there compared to ochel. It all compares to the food itself, meaning the stems are not taken under consideration. So if there's more psolet than ochel, then we're going to say it's kshera. You can use this for your sukkah. okay? Because again, the fruits are susceptible to impurity, but the psolet, the leaves are not. So if there's many more leaves than food, then we're gonna ignore the food and only count the leaves and the stems, and therefore, right, we'll say this clearly shows there's no law of yadot. The yadot aren't serving any purpose for the fruit, otherwise they go along with the fruit. But now, im lav, but if not, psula. But if not, meaning there's more fruit than leaves, then we're going to call it disqualified. That seems to sound like Rav Menashe, which is there's no law of yadot. But acherim omrim ad shiu kashim merubim al hayadot ve'al chalim. You need the stem. Now here he seems to only be relating to the grains. Pay attention. It says, if the stalks of grain were greater than the yad and the food, meaning the grain, the kernel, and the part attached to it, meaning we treat that like the food, in which case there is still a law of food when it comes to, of yad, when it comes to schach. So therefore, my lav b'hakam, is this not the debate? Demar savar yesh lahem yadot, demar savar ein lahem yadot. Right? The first opinion that says there is no yad, and therefore it goes, the yad is with the psolet, right? And the food is judged separately. The second opinion says, no, it has a law of yad, and that's why the yad is still considered in the calculation with the food, because the yad serves the food. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. Rabbi Abba vadai tinai, right? And then that would be Rabbi Menashe, right? He says, when it comes to the grains, it is, right? There is no law of yad. And the one who disagrees with him, Rabbi Abba, who says it's only true for the grapes, would say when it comes to grains, we do have a law of yad. But now we say no. Rabbi Abba vadai tinai. According to Rabbi Abba, he can't possibly agree with the first opinion. There has to be a machloket between, this has to be the debate. Is there yad? Is there not yad? That's the debate between Tanakam and Acherim. But Amar Lecha Rav Menashe could say, if he were here, he's not here, but he could say, I'm going to explain both opinions according to my opinion. Why? Everyone agrees if I cut it for schach, it doesn't have a law of yad. This case that they were debating here, this Tanaitic debate, was a little bit different. This is very important in terms of, we've seen many times already in Shas, that how much a person's intent factors into things has a level of significance, sometimes more, sometimes less. That's going to be the debate here. So if I cut them for the purposes of eating, in which case my yad was significant, but then I changed my mind and I decided, I decided I want to use this as my schach, which means that I no longer have use for the yad. So basically we're going to say that's the machloket. If I change my mind, can I now say the yad is no longer significant to me? Or do we say that doesn't work? I already cut it with the intent of eating it. Therefore, the yad already had significance. And by my changing my use of what I'm doing, it doesn't really help. So now they say, wait a minute. What would be the rabbis? We understand the other acherim's opinion. Why? Because if I cut it to eat, my yad has significance. Just because I changed my mind about it doesn't really do anything. It was just a change of mind. I could easily change my mind back. Just like I decided this, right? I could be very flippant. I could say, oh no, you know what? I'm going to eat it. Then my yad comes back to being susceptible to impurity. So I can't just, in a snap, change my mind this way. I can just easily change it back. Machshava isn't really significant. But what about the rabbis? They basically say the fact that I now switch what I want to use it for. I'll give you an example with Tuma. Okay, let's say we're going to come to this in a minute. Let's say I decide to create leather. I'm making leather from the hide of an animal for my couch. So when does it become susceptible to impurity? When it's ready to go on my couch as a cover, when it becomes exactly what I needed it for. But what if I decide that while I'm making it, I decide, you know what? I don't need to finish it off, finish the stitching and everything. I'm just going to use it as a cover to just throw over my couch or over a bench or something. And then it can be unfinished and usable. As soon as it becomes usable, I've determined that I want to use this for the purposes of a cover, and therefore it's ready right now, then it's already susceptible to impurity. But if I was planning only to use it for a couch, it would only become impure or susceptible to impurity when I finished what I was actually planning to do. So their machshava works, but we're going to see that it only works for that purpose, not for other purposes. We're going to see. So if you're going to say that I cut it to eat. But then I changed my mind, decided to use it as schach. And that's the debate between them. My time I would do Rabbanan. Rabbanan don't really make sense. If you want to say kasav Rabbanan kivanti nulach aleim l'sikuch, since I changed my mind for sikuch, but lalei machshavto. So I changed my intent. But you can't just use intent to cancel out its susceptibility to impurity. That's not like the case that I just gave about the couch. Why? Anything can become impure, as I said with the couch. I'm in the middle of making this. If I stop in the middle and say, it's ready right now, I'm going to use it for something else before it's actually finished, because for this purpose, it's finished, it's ready. I can do that by intent alone. That can create, now it's going to be susceptible to impurity. That's taking it from a state of not susceptible to susceptible. But but if I want to take it from a status where it's impure, let's say I used it, I plan to use it. No, let's think of something else. Our case, let's just use our case. I plan to eat it, so it was susceptible to impurity. But now I want to take off its susceptibility to impurity by saying now I'm using it for schach. At that point, I don't need the yad. The yad's not going to be in this law of impurity that it can transfer impurity to the fruit, because I don't really care that the yad's connected to the fruit. That doesn't work just by my thinking I'm going to use it for schach. It's much harder to change something once it's already susceptible to impurity. Machshava doesn't work. So how could the rabbis possibly say that machshava works here, that would be the case? Now, again, this was Rav Menashe's way of reading that source to say it's actually not a machloket tanaim. All of them agree with me. It's just that this case is a little different than the one we were describing, because this one started off for food and then got moved. And then there's a debate whether that can create it retains its status of susceptible to impurity, or it changes its status of being susceptible to impurity. But with which we said the rabbis who say it changes its status and is no longer can't possibly say that, because machshava is not enough to change status. I'm going to leave you here with that question, and we will pick up here tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.